The morning air was crisp as Daniel Carter stepped into the small cafe, the familiar scent of fresh coffee wrapping around him like an old friend. The place wasn't fancy, just a modest shop with wooden tables, a chalkboard menu above the counter, and a quiet hum of conversation from the scattered customers inside. The city outside was already alive, cars honking, people rushing to work. But inside the cafe, there was a certain peace that Daniel had come to appreciate. He took his usual seat near the window, where he could watch the world pass by. His fingers curled around the warm ceramic of his black coffee, steam rising in slow, lazy swirls. He didn't mind the quiet. In fact, he preferred it. The years had taught him the value of silence, of stillness, especially after a lifetime spent in places where neither existed. His jacket, the old one with the faded U.S. Marine Corps patch, lay draped over the chair beside him. Daniel wasn't looking for attention. He never did. He was just another man blending into the background, as he had learned to do so well. But life had a funny way of testing you when you least expected it. The door swung open with a sharp jingle of the bell, and the peace in the cafe was instantly broken. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. 3 uniformed police officers walked in, their voices loud and their presence commanding attention. They were young, too young, Daniel thought, their uniforms still crisp, their faces untouched by the kind of experiences that carve deep lines into a man's soul. They walked with the swagger of men who believed they owned every room they entered, their laughter sharp and careless. Daniel barely glanced up. He had seen men like this before. Not bad men necessarily, just untested. The kind that thought a badge gave them the same weight as real experience. He turned his attention back to his coffee, but he didn't need to watch them to know what kind of men they were. The first sign of trouble came when they cut in line, stepping ahead of an elderly woman who had been patiently waiting at the counter. The woman hesitated, unsure of whether to say something. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a name tag that read Hayes, shot her a look that made it clear she wasn't going first. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers pressing against the ceramic of his cup. He forced himself to relax. Not your fight, Carter. The woman stepped back, unwilling to cause trouble, and the officers placed their orders, still talking loudly amongst themselves. Hayes leaned against the counter as he waited, tapping his fingers idly, his eyes scanning the cafe. Then he saw Daniel. His gaze lingered on the old Marine Corps patch on Daniel's jacket, and a smirk curled at the corner of his lips. The conversation shifted, the volume lowering just slightly, but Daniel could still hear it. Man, some of these guys just can't let go of the past, huh? Hayes muttered to his buddies, his voice carrying enough for the room to hear, walking around like they're still in the fight. Hate to break it to you, old-timer, but no one cares about your little war stories anymore. Laughter rippled between the officers. Daniel didn't move. He stirred his coffee slowly, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid swirling in the cup. His heartbeat remained steady, controlled. The years had taught him patience. Don't react, that's what they want. But the officers weren't finished. One of the others, a wiry man with a cocky smirk, Maxwell by his badge, stepped closer, glancing at Daniel's jacket. Hey, old man, what's with the jacket? Trying to impress people with that marine patch? You think that makes you special? Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee. Controlled movements, measured. He set the cup down with precision, finally looking up. His steel gray eyes met Maxwell's, and the younger man's smirk faltered, just slightly. You don't have a clue what you're talking about, Daniel said evenly. Maxwell chuckled, shaking his head. Oh yeah? And what exactly don't I know? That you're just another vet living off the system? Sitting around, drinking coffee while the rest of us actually do something? More laughter. A few people in the cafe shifted uncomfortably, watching, waiting, but no one spoke up. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had faced worse men than these. Men who didn't just throw words, but bullets. Men who had looked him in the eye before pulling the trigger. Hayes leaned forward, enjoying the moment, wanting to push further. You know what your problem is? You think just because you fought in some war decades ago, the world owes you something. Maybe you should learn your place. The words hit hard, not because Daniel believed them, but because he had heard them before, from people who had never stood for anything in their lives. For the first time, Daniel moved. Not aggressively, not with anger, just purposefully. He reached over, grabbed his jacket, and laid it across his lap. His eyes never left Hayes. "You want to know something about real service?" Daniel's voice was steady, powerful in its calmness. "You want to talk about knowing your place?" The cafe fell silent. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "I spent 20 years in the Marine Corps," he said. "Led men into battles you couldn't even comprehend. Held dying soldiers in my arms. I've been places where there were no rules, no badges, no backup, just men doing what had to be done to make sure the guy next to them made it home." Maxwell's smirk was gone. Hayes's expression had shifted, something uneasy flickering in his eyes. "You talk about criminals, about learning my place," Daniel continued, his voice unwavering. "Son, I've looked real evil in the eye. I've seen men who had no mercy, no hesitation. And do you know what separated us from them?" He let the question hang for a moment before answering it himself. "Honor, respect, discipline, things they never had, things they never understood." Hayes swallowed, his jaw tightening. You wear that uniform," Daniel cut him off, nodding at the badge on his chest. "You think it gives you power. It doesn't. It gives you responsibility. Responsibility to act with dignity, to protect, to serve. You don't get respect because you demand it. You get it because you earn it. And right now," he let the weight of his words sink in, "you haven't earned a damn thing." The silence that followed was suffocating. Maxwell shifted uncomfortably. The third officer, who had been quiet the whole time, stared at the floor. Hayes's fingers curled slightly at his sides, but he said nothing. Slowly, Daniel leaned back, picking up his coffee again. He took a slow sip before setting it down. "Now," he said quietly, "are we done here?" Hayes didn't answer. He just looked at Daniel for a long moment before nodding slightly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe. The other two followed, their confidence shattered. As the door swung shut behind them, a hush still hung in the air. Then, slowly, a few customers gave small nods of respect toward Daniel. The elderly woman in line earlier smiled softly. The barista, a young woman behind the counter, stepped forward, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "On the house," she said softly. "Thank you for your service." Daniel nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't need recognition, he never had. But today, in this quiet little cafe, he had reminded at least 3 men what real respect looked like. And that was enough. The cafe door swung shut behind the officers, but the weight of their presence lingered. The room was still, the tension hanging in the air like a storm that had passed but left behind the scent of rain. Conversations had stopped. Coffee cups remained half-raised to lips that no longer sipped, and for a brief moment, all eyes were on Daniel. He didn't acknowledge them. He simply reached for the fresh cup of coffee that had been placed before him, lifted it, and took a slow sip. The warmth of it spread through him. But it wasn't the coffee that settled his pulse. It was the silence. The understanding that in this moment, he had won, not through force, not through anger, but through something far stronger. Truth. The young barista still hovered nearby, her hands clasped in front of her. She hesitated, as if debating whether to speak, then finally found her voice. "I meant it, you know, about the coffee." She smiled, a small but genuine thing. "My grandpa was in the army, Korea. He used to tell me stories all the time. Always said respect is something you show, not something you demand." Daniel nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but feeling no need to respond with words. He had spent his life around soldiers, men who knew that the loudest ones in the room were often the weakest. Words didn't win battles. Actions did. Across the cafe, the old woman who had been shoved aside in line shuffled over, her small frame moving cautiously as if stepping onto unfamiliar ground. She stood beside his table, her wrinkled hands clasped together. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that reminded him of home, of another life before the deployments, before the loss, before the nights where sleep never truly came. "But I'm glad you did." He gave a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passed between those who understood things without needing to say them. "Kids these days," she muttered, shaking her head as she turned to leave. No respect. Daniel watched her go, knowing it wasn't just about the officers or even about him. It was about something deeper, something that had shifted in the world over time. People had forgotten what true service looked like. They had forgotten that respect wasn't a right given with a uniform, but a weight carried with dignity and sacrifice. He exhaled, feeling a bit of the tension leave his body. He should have let it go. He should have finished his coffee, picked up his jacket, and walked out of that cafe, back into the quiet existence he had built for himself. But something about today felt unfinished. Through the large front window, Daniel could see the officers standing beside their patrol car, still parked near the curb. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't the same cocky men who had walked in earlier. Hayes was standing with his arms crossed, staring down at the pavement, his jaw set tight. Maxwell was talking, his hands gesturing quickly, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. The third one, the silent one, was leaning against the car, his gaze distant, thoughtful. Daniel knew that look. He had seen it on younger soldiers who had just faced something they weren't ready for. The kind of realization that made a man question his own reflection. They weren't done. Not yet. He took one last sip of coffee, then stood, grabbing his jacket and slinging it over his shoulder. As he stepped outside, the cool air met his skin, the scent of rain in the distance. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had walked battlefields and lived to tell the story. Not because he wanted to, but because others hadn't been so lucky. The officers noticed him immediately. Maxwell tensed, standing up straighter, his hands sliding into his belt. Hayes turned, his eyes narrowing slightly. But he didn't say anything. The third officer, the one who hadn't spoken much, was the first to break the silence. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant but not disrespectful. Daniel met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something different in his eyes. Not arrogance, not anger, something closer to understanding. The officer hesitated, then cleared his throat. "I just wanted to say, we were out of line in there." Hayes shot him a sharp look, but he didn't interrupt. Maxwell crossed his arms, shifting his weight, clearly still defensive. "Look, old man, you don't get it. We deal with real criminals out here, every day. You think because you wore a uniform, you get to lecture us?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering Maxwell, the tension in his stance, the barely concealed frustration in his voice. He wasn't angry at Daniel. He was angry at himself. "I don't think anything," Daniel finally said, his voice even. "I know what I've done, and I know what I've seen, and I know men who died for something bigger than themselves. Can you say the same?" Maxwell opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked away. Daniel took a step closer, his voice lowering just slightly. "You think wearing that badge makes you better than other people? That it gives you the right to walk into a room and take what you want? Push people around? You don't even understand the weight of what you're carrying." Maxwell clenched his jaw, the tension in his posture unrelenting. Hayes was still silent, his eyes flicking between Daniel and his fellow officer. The third officer, the one who had apologized, spoke again. "I've got an uncle who was in the Marines," he said. "He doesn't talk about it much, but when he does, I see that same look in your eyes." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The young officer sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. We were out of line," he admitted again, quieter this time. "You were right about respect. It's not about demanding it. It's about earning it." Maxwell shifted uncomfortably, but Hayes finally spoke, his voice low. "Yeah, maybe." Daniel let the silence settle, let the weight of it press into them. He wasn't here to humiliate them. He wasn't here to win anything. He was here to teach them a lesson that too many had forgotten. After a long moment, he simply nodded. "Then do better," he said. "It's not too late to be the men you're supposed to be." With that, he turned, leaving them standing there, their reflections in the cruiser's windows no longer quite as confident as before. As Daniel walked down the sidewalk, the wind picking up around him, he didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel powerful. He just felt like a soldier who had done his job one last time. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The city lights flickered in the distance as Daniel walked down the sidewalk, his steps slow but steady. He had said his piece. He had left those young officers with something to think about, something they wouldn't forget anytime soon. But even as he moved further away from them, he could still feel the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. He had spent years trying to stay out of the spotlight, to live quietly, to let the world move on without him. Yet, here he was, once again forced to remind men of a truth they should have already known. He adjusted his jacket, the familiar Marine Corps patch rubbing against his fingers. It wasn't about the past. It wasn't about reliving the days when he was in uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had understood the meaning of service. No, it was about the present, about what he saw every day. People forgetting what it meant to carry responsibility, to wear a uniform with honor rather than entitlement. A soft drizzle began to fall, the scent of rain mixing with the asphalt, the city streets glistening under the glow of streetlights. Daniel welcomed it. The rain had always been a familiar companion. It had been there in the jungles, in the deserts, in places where men fought and bled and never came home. He had learned to appreciate its quiet presence, how it washed away the dirt and the blood, leaving only what remained underneath. He wasn't thinking about the officers anymore. He was thinking about the men he had served with, the ones who had given everything and never asked for recognition. He thought about Reyes, his best friend, who had died saving a convoy from an ambush. He thought about Lieutenant Harmon, a fresh-faced officer who had barely been old enough to drink before he was leading men into battle. He thought about the countless names etched into stone memorials, their sacrifices now reduced to whispers and fading memories. And yet, in a small cafe, in a single moment, Daniel had kept their legacy alive. He had reminded those officers that the world didn't owe them respect just because they wore a badge. They had to earn it, just like the men who had come before them. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him, fast and deliberate. He didn't tense, he never tensed. He had been trained to hear a man's intent in the way he moved, to recognize the rhythm of danger long before it struck. But this wasn't danger. This was hesitation. "Sir!" a voice called out. Daniel stopped. He turned slowly, rain dripping from the edge of his jacket. Standing there, a few feet away, was the younger officer, the quiet one. The one who had recognized something in Daniel that the others had not. His uniform was slightly damp from the rain, his face unreadable, but there was something in his stance, in the way he stood, that told Daniel he was here for more than just an apology. "Look," the officer said, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I know we were out of line. I know we acted like arrogant pricks back there." He exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. "But I just wanted to say that what you said back there, about responsibility, about earning respect." He paused, searching for the right words. "That stuck with me?" Daniel said nothing, just studied him with those sharp, worn-down eyes that had seen too much. He didn't need to speak. The young officer wasn't looking for validation. He was looking for understanding. "My dad was in the Navy," the officer continued, his voice quieter now. "He wasn't in combat or anything, but he always talked about guys like you, the ones who went through hell so the rest of us didn't have to." He shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "I guess I forgot about that. Forgot what it really means to wear a uniform." Daniel nodded slightly, his gaze steady. "It's easy to forget when no one reminds you." The officer swallowed hard. "I guess what I'm trying to say is, thanks for reminding me." Daniel didn't smile. He didn't nod again. He just looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his face, the quiet weight of realization settling over him. The kid wasn't just apologizing, he was changing. "That's up to you now," Daniel said simply. "You don't need to thank me, you just need to do better." The officer took a deep breath, nodding. "I will." For a moment, they stood there, two men from two different generations, but connected by the same understanding. Service wasn't about glory, it was about duty, about sacrifice. Then, without another word, the young officer turned and walked away, disappearing back toward his patrol car. Daniel watched him go, the rain falling heavier now, soaking into the pavement. He turned back toward the street, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The night felt different now. Not lighter, not easier, but better. As he walked, he thought about the officers again, not about the way they had mocked him, but about the way they had left. Humbled, changed, that was what mattered. They weren't the first men to need a lesson like that, and they wouldn't be the last. But for tonight, for this moment, Daniel Carter had done his part. He had reminded the world, that respect wasn't something you took. It was something you earned, and that, he decided, was enough. The rain had grown heavier by the time Daniel reached the quiet stretch of road leading toward the edge of town. His boots splashed against shallow puddles, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his jacket. The Marine Corps patch on his sleeve had darkened with the damp, but he didn't mind. He welcomed the rain. It had always been there, from the jungles to the deserts, washing away blood, sweat, and the weight of memories that refused to fade. Tonight, it felt like it was washing away something else, the lingering heaviness of the past. He didn't know why the encounter with the officers had stuck with him so much. Maybe it was because he had seen it before, the same arrogance in younger men who thought power was something you wielded rather than something you carried with reverence. Maybe it was because he had been that young once, sure of himself, unshaken by the world, until the world had shattered everything he thought he knew. Or maybe it was just because he was tired of watching people forget what real sacrifice looked like. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up behind him. The engine rumbled softly, and a faint beam of headlights cut through the rain, illuminating his shadow as it stretched across the wet pavement. He didn't tense, didn't stop walking. If they had come back for another fight, they weren't going to like how it ended. The car slowed to a crawl, the tires rolling over the soaked street before finally stopping just ahead of him. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. He hadn't expected to see them again so soon. The driver's side door swung open, and Officer Hayes stepped out, rain soaking his uniform almost instantly. He didn't bother with an umbrella, didn't even seem to care about the downpour drenching him. He just stood there, looking at Daniel through the haze of falling water. His posture was different now. There was no arrogance, no false confidence. Daniel stopped a few feet away, meeting Hayes' gaze but saying nothing. "Listen," Hayes said, his voice steady, but missing that bravado he had carried in the cafe. "I messed up back there. We all did." Daniel exhaled, shifting slightly but remaining silent. He had no intention of making this easy. "I don't expect you to care," Hayes continued, rubbing the back of his neck. "And honestly, I don't even know why I'm standing out here in the damn rain trying to explain myself to you. But I guess I just wanted you to know that what you said back there, it got to me." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "And trust me, that doesn't happen often." Daniel studied him for a long moment. The younger man's hands weren't in his pockets, weren't resting on his belt. They were open, unclenched, a small but important detail. It meant he wasn't here out of obligation. He was here because something had shifted inside him. "You think words fix everything?" Daniel finally asked, his voice calm but firm. Hayes shook his head. "Number, I don't. But I think maybe they're a start." The rain drummed between them, steady and unrelenting. Daniel looked past Hayes at the squad car idling on the side of the road. Maxwell and the third officer were still inside, watching but not interfering. Daniel sighed, rubbing his fingers together before speaking. "You walk around wearing that badge, thinking it makes you something. You think it means you've already earned respect just because people are forced to give it to you." His voice was low, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness honed by years of hard truths. "But a uniform doesn't make a man. It never has. It never will." Hayes nodded slightly, his face unreadable. "Yeah, I get that now." Daniel scoffed. "Do you?" Hayes was silent for a beat, then exhaled. "Number, not completely, but I want to." Daniel ran a hand over his damp face, feeling the cool rain trail down his skin. The world wasn't black and white. He had learned that long ago. Men weren't just good or bad, they were flawed, complicated, caught somewhere in between who they thought they were and who they wanted to be. "You ever serve?" Daniel asked finally. Hayes shook his head. "Number? My old man did. He was Army. Never talked about it much, though." Daniel nodded. He understood that well enough. "Well, let me tell you something your old man probably never did," he said, his voice rough. "The hardest part about wearing a uniform, any uniform, isn't the job itself. It's knowing that you're supposed to be better, that you have to be better. Not because you have a gun on your hip or a badge on your chest, but because people look to you for something they don't know how to find anywhere else. Dignity, honor, strength, and if you don't give them that, if you don't uphold that, then you're just another man with power, and power without discipline makes you no better than the people you think you're protecting them from. Hayes didn't speak for a long time. The rain poured between them, but he stood there, taking in every word. Finally, he nodded, not a dismissive nod, not an obligatory one, a real one. "I hear you," Hayes said, his voice quieter now. Daniel took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "Then prove it." Hayes swallowed hard, rain running down his face, plastering his uniform to his skin. "I will." Daniel held his gaze for a moment longer before finally nodding. That was all he needed to hear. He turned, stepping off the curb, back toward the dark stretch of road ahead. "You need a ride?" Hayes called out after him. Daniel shook his head without looking back. "I've been walking a long time, kid. I'll manage." Hayes stood there, watching as Daniel disappeared into the mist of rain and streetlights until he was nothing more than a shadow blending into the darkness. Inside the squad car, Maxwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You think that old guy really changed anything?" he muttered. Hayes wiped the rain from his face, looking down at his badge, then back at the road where Daniel had gone. He thought about the weight of what he carried, what it meant now compared to just a few hours ago. "Yeah," Hayes said, his voice certain this time. "I think he did." Maxwell didn't argue. He just sat back in his seat, staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. As the squad car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the night, Daniel continued walking, feeling the rain soak through his clothes, feeling the cool wind against his face. He had no destination, no mission, no orders to follow. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something that mattered. And in the end, that was all he had ever really wanted. End of story.